All right. So just to recap what we talked about in the last video on lists, lists are a data type. The unique thing about lists is that they are in an ordered sequence, and the list value refers to the list itself. Some other things inside a list are called items, and they are comma delimited, which you can see here. You can have a space in here that's preferred by the Python language, but if you don't have a space, it will still work. So note that when we work on the midterm, if for some reason you get counted off, it's just because there wasn't a space there. I'll still count it as the code executes, but it's good practice to make sure you have a space after the comma. All right, we do use square brackets to indicate this is a list, as you can see here. We talked about getting the indexes. So remember that indexes start at 0 and then progress their way up. So 0, 1, 2, 3. We also talked about negative indexes. So -1 is going to start from the right-hand side or the end of the list and work its way back. We talked about using lists to pull out some small sections of a list so that we can reduce it down, or maybe we want to just pull some additional data. We can get the length of a list by passing it to the len function. So we've used the len function in the past with strings. We could also use it with a list to find out how many values are inside that list. We can change those values inside the list by specifying them as such. So we give the name of the list, we give the index we want to change, and what we want to set that index to. We can do concatenation and replication. So we can do two lists together. We can concatenate those with the plus sign. We can also replicate those with a multiple sign. Yeah.
What value is the like if you don't like set a value on the list, what is it like defaulted to?
You talking about up here?
Yeah, so like if I declare like a list and I like put items for 1, 2, 3, and then like skip 4 and then put 1 for 5.
You can't.
Oh, I can't?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, the only thing you could do is put a value in for a none, but you cannot skip values as they go in there. They're always in an ordered list, and they always have to have something in there. And it can be any data type, remember? So right now here, we're just showing strings, but you can have integers, you can have floating points, you can even have other lists. So lists inside of lists. You can have Boolean values, so true, false. I think those are the only ones that we've learned so far. Good question, though. But yeah, it needs to be in a specific ordered section here, and there cannot be any blanks in between there.
All right, thank you.
No problem. We talked about using the delete statement. This will remove a value from a list. Note that when you do remove a value from a list, it's going to change the indexes. So for example, in this one, if we do del spam 2, that means 1, 0, 1, 2. We're going to remove rat, which means elephant is now in the second or the number 2 index. All right, we talked about working with lists. Let's see here. We talked about using for loops in order to get through a list. Remember that the range command is very similar to using a list, as the range command generates a list of whatever you plug into it. For loops are handy to iterate through any kind of list and either print them out, or you can modify them or use the data for some other function. You can use in and not in order to check whether or not a particular value is inside there, or a value is inside the list as an item. And we got the multiple assignment trick where we assign different values by using comma separated values equal to the list itself. This helps just shorten assigning like descriptor words or something like that if you wanted to use those values separately. You could also use the enumerate function. The enumerate function is really handy in that it will return you both back the index as well as the value itself. It does return you as a tuple when it comes out there. So what you want to do is make sure that you use the multiple assignment in your for loop in order to label those two values as they come out. We talked about random choice and random shuffle. This will allow you to select something out of a list. So if you had a whole bunch of options in a list, you can randomly select one out of there using random choice. This is faster and easier than doing something like a random int, finding a number for the index, and then plugging that number in to call that value out. We also have random shuffle. This can be handy if you want to shuffle things inside of a list. You can do random shuffle and do that. To use these two random ones, you have to remember to import random at the top of your script. Let's see, augmented assignment. I've been telling you this all along, so they just now address it in the curriculum. But instead of writing something like spam equals 42 and we want to add 1 to that, we would have to do something like spam equals spam plus 1, and then spam equals 43. The shortcut to doing this spam equals spam plus 1 is just to do plus equals 1. You can do this with plus equals, minus equals, multiplication, division, and modulus.
You can do that with strings too.
You can, yes. Yes. So if you want to add two strings together, like in this example down here, you can do it to where like spam is equal to hello. You want to add something to that string, you would do spam plus equals space hello world or something like that. Same way with the multiplication, you could do it with a list, then you could do times 3, and this would be the equivalent of doing Zophie with a asterisk 3 over here, so you get Zophie, Zophie, Zophie.
Is it possible to write equal first, then write the plus sign?
No. Has to be in that order that you see there.
Yep.
It'll throw an error. Great questions, guys. I really appreciate asking questions like that. Trust me, you're not the only one that has a question out of 75 students. You are just the few that I get to actually interact with during the recording. So, all right. Anybody have any questions before we get into list methods? Awesome. If you guys come up with something along the way, feel free to interject. That does not bother me whatsoever. All right, methods. So a method is something similar to a function, except it's called on a given value. And so, for example, when we're doing a list value we stored in spam, you could call the dot index of that list in order to get the index value back out of it. So in other words, we know what a value is inside of our list, right? We know that we want to get hello, but we don't know which index hello is in. So for example, if we have this spam equals, and then we see this list option here, we have spam.index hello. And when you call this, you always use your list here, and then we have dot index. Note that we're not putting index in front, which would make it more of a function. This is called a method where we use a dot and then we're calling a function after it. Again, it's referred to as a method. So the index method, if we call that on spam, and spam being a list, we then pass in what value we want to get the index from. And therefore, if we put in hello in this list, we will get the 0 index. It's in the first part. If we want to check hey us, then we can see that this is going to fall in 3. 0, 1, 2, 3. If we plug something in that doesn't exist in the value, then if like this, we're going to get a traceback and value error. This would be a good choice to use like a try and accept. And that way you could accept on a value error or accept overall and make sure that you can continue with your code. So it's a way to get the value that's in there. Another way to check this before you do this ahead of time, remember that you have the not in and in operator. So you would be able to check if it exists first before you try and go and get the index. That would be another option that you could do inside your code. If you have more than one index of the same thing, so for example, we have Puka here twice inside this list, it's going to return the first one that it finds. So we can find this one here. It will not return this last one in the list. Anybody have any questions over these methods? There's a lot of methods to lists. So ask questions, and there's a lot of reasons to have things in lists. You got to do a lot of things. You got to add, you got to subtract, you got to remove, you got to manipulate, you want to get different values out. So lots of methods we're about to cover today. All right, so that first one was index. The next one is going to be append and insert. So we talked about what it is to replace a value. We just set the spam, give us the index that you want to change, and then the value that you want to change it to. However, you may just want to add things to the list. So you would use the .append method, and then you can append whatever you want out to that spam thing. So what can be handy here is, let me fire up idle. And we're going to do just a new one here real quick. All right, so let's say I have students, right? And we're going to start this with an empty list. And we can say, while true, print, please enter the name of the student. Then we're going to get an input. So we're going to call it student equals input. There we go. So what we're going to do in this little short program here is we're going to start with an empty list of students. We're going to prompt the user to give us a name of a student. And then with that, we're going to add that to our list of students. So that way we can grow. This is kind of like a really basic student roster, for example. So as we get this one in here, we will say, let's do a quick check here. We can do a quick check with try. And what we're going to do is try to do an int on student. This is very rough as a way of testing. So the idea of doing int student, if that works, then we need to loop them back. So we want to say continue. And then if it accepts, then what we want to do is take our students, which is our list, students, and we want to do a .append, and we're going to append the student name that they typed in. At that point, we can go ahead and continue on. Now, before we do this continue, we're going to do a quick print here, and we're going to say that is not a valid student name. Okay, so what does this mean? What I did was a try and accept, and this is very, very rough in doing it. But what I'm trying to do is make sure that if somebody, when we ask them to put in a name, that we want to make sure it's a name. If they type in 42, then we want to make sure that if we can convert that to an integer, then that means they typed in a number, which means we don't want that to be a valid name. So we're going to print and tell them it's not a valid name, and then continue the loop. In other words, start it back all over again. If it does an exception because we can't convert whatever they typed into a number, then on that accept, we're going to go ahead and append that to our students list, and then we're going to continue and loop them back over. Now, we probably want a way out of this loop, but if we just run this for now, and then actually let's do this. At the top of our list, we're just going to say print current student list. And then in the next line, we're going to print that list, so students. And there's much better ways of doing this, which we're going to test here in just a little bit. All right, so let's run this. We're going to call this one students. All right, so you can see we have a list up here at the top, and notice anytime that you print a list, you're going to get these square brackets. Now, in your guys' projects and such, I wouldn't want you to ever print a list directly to the screen. It's a little ugly. You got the square brackets, it's going to be kind of comma separated, etc. There's better ways to do that, and there's some homework assignments that you guys will work on next week and stuff to start manipulating that a little bit so it looks better. But I'll show you an example here in a minute. So we have, please enter the name of the student. We're going to put in Jason, and notice how it added it to the list. And then the next time we went through our loop, let me get this dragged over here. So we came down here, we entered the name of a student. We have this input prompt. It could not convert it to an integer. Therefore, it added students.append student, and then continued back over the lip. Now, to make sure that we are actually hitting this one, let's just throw in a little print statement and say added. Now, again, I'm showing you this way because this is what you guys are used to. Added student to the students list. Okay, so what did this do? This just put the name in there so that we can get confirmation that it actually added. Now we can tell that because we printed out the list but it's good to build in a little product inside of here so that as a user of this class roster program, that we are able to make sure it got added. So we hit there, we can say add adjacent to the students list, and the program starts over. Another good idea here would be just throw in an extra line break. Another way you guys can do this for now, as you guys haven't learned the /ins particularly, is just do a print, empty print symbol here, and that will do the same thing. So if we run this, now we type in JSON, we get it to look a little bit cleaner, and you can see how we're starting to build this class roster program. So, and this is just an example that I kind of do from time to time. So there's a couple things that we could do when we first start out. We can do print, and we can say, let's use the hashtag sign, and we're going to do that times, let's call it 40 here. And then we're going to say print my class roster program. Print, and we're just going to copy this same line in here. And last but not least, we're going to add a print. There we go. So we're going to run this. And notice we're just making this starting to look like a little cleaner program. Now later, you guys are going to learn how to center this type of thing, and then you can really make this program start to look good. But right now, we have a simple little program where we are able to add students to here. So if we add students like this, notice how they're getting added to the student list. Now this is okay, but that's not the best way to display that information, right? What we can do is, instead of just printing the whole list, let's use one of those for loops that we had. So for student, we're going to actually call him stud because we're going to use student as an actual value here. So we could call this like new student would probably be a better naming structure here. And then that means we need to change this to new student and this to new student and this one to new student. Okay. So now we can have for student and students. So what does this do? This is saying we're going to loop through our students list, and we're going to assign the value of student to everyone that we go through. So the first time we get the word student, and we can manipulate that student. So we could say very simply just student here. That's going to put that list out. And then before we start the please print a name, let's go ahead and just throw in these empty prints. All right, let's take a look at what this looks like. So now if I put in JSON, notice we're getting a nice clean list here. So I put in students and we start to get this and it displays out. Does anybody have any questions over this very rudimentary class roster? Okay. So for example, what we may want to do is, and we're just using append right now. What we could say is, let's see, we've added these people in there, and what we could do in this check is please enter the name of the student. What we're actually going to do is say, or press enter to exit. And then what we need to do, if we're going to do this, what that's going to allow them to do is just enter in any line. And if that line is empty, then we want to make sure we exit the program. So at this point, we want to come up here and import sys. If you remember, we used sysexit here in a couple chapters ago. So we're going to say if new student equals.
I don't know if you're supposed to put imports. You put imports. I don't know if that would affect it.
Good catch. Thank you. All right. So if we have a new student, then what we want to do is say print. And we can say here is the final list. And then we have, oops, get a little quote here. And we're going to do, for the purposes of this, we're just going to copy this out. Okay. So we're just going to print this one last time. Once we get to the end of the students, we're going to do a sys.exit, and that's going to end our program. So let's save that, run that real quick. We'll see this over here. So if we press JSON, we have Sam, Derek, Gina. Okay, we have these students in there. If I just press enter, note that we're going to say, here's the final list. We dump it all out, and we're at the end of our program. So now we have a way of adding people to the list, and we can display at the end what's actually going on. Now notice I'm starting to repeat code, right? So for students and students print, for students and students print. What should I do at this point when it comes to that?
Make it a function.
You got it. So let's go back a couple chapters and we talked about functions. Let's do a def print students, right? And for this, we would just copy this in, just like this. Now, we need to pass in our students list. So we need to have a variable passed into this function called students so that we can go ahead and loop through this and print it out. Then instead of calling these two lines, we just do a simple function of print students, and we're going to pass in our students list. There we go. And we can take this and put it in here. Now it looks like we're not saving a whole lot of code, but that means that anytime now I want to print the students list, it will go ahead and print that students list. We can also save a line and say, here's the current student list. And then we could say, here is the final student list. So what we could do here is we could cheat and we could save a line that says print. Let's see this. Let's call this text, for lack of a better word at this point. So what we're going to say is text, and we're going to say text enter here. And then we're going to do a string concatenation and say student list. And let me explain what we're actually doing here. So now what I have is this other required variable up at the top. And what we can do is on this print statement, instead of saying current student list, now what we can do is pass in current as another argument to this particular function. And now we no longer need this here. So now we're just down to one line. And here we want to call it final list. So we're going to just change our language up here and we're going to call it final. So let's do final. And that prints that in there. Awesome. So what did we just do there? If we run this program, notice we have current student list and there's nobody in there. What we could do is do another check just to make sure this is a little cleaner. And we could say if len of students equals 0, print there are no students in the list. And we can return at that point. Otherwise, we want to go ahead and continue on down here. So let's go ahead and run that. And you can see there's no students in the list. So the program just naturally starts getting cleaner and cleaner as you start to build it out. So now I have Jason. We'll notice that in the current student list, it's been repeated and now it's being passed in. Sam, Derek, Gina, enter. Notice now we have this nice little prompt. It says final student list and it prints out everybody in between. Anybody have any questions or not quite following along with the little changes I made in this program? Okay, so what we're doing here is we're adding students to the list, right? Well, maybe we want other functions in our program, right? We probably want to be able to maybe inject students in the list or change students in the list, etc. So let's create a new function called def add student. And we're just going to take this entire code that we created here, cut it out of our main program and put it into a function so that any time that we call add student, it runs through that nice little code that we did. Now, in order to use students inside of here, because we're just manipulating this, remember, I can't append to a global variable. And right now, students is a global variable. So if I want to manipulate that global variable, does anybody remember what we have to do?
Do you add it as an argument?
You could. That's a great one. So if I do this as an argument, I say students, the problem with that is I'm not going to be manipulating it outside in the global side. So if I do it here, I'm just going to be passing in information, and it would add a student to that list. But once this function's done, students disappears again.
Is it the and sign?
Nope.
Oh, I'm thinking of C++.
Yes, that's okay. All right. So remember, the hint there is that we want to modify a global variable, right? So we need to use the global statement, and then we just call whatever global variable that we want to manipulate. So global students, that allows us to manipulate this global statement here. So we're going to call this a global variable, just as a note, and we can see that that's going through and doing that. Now, the next thing I would do is we have a print students, add student. We could add another function here just to keep things a little cleaner. And we can say main, actually we could say intro, call it that. And inside this intro, let's go ahead and move this stuff in here up to our intro. Awesome. So now when we have our main program down here, let's just call intro. And then from intro, we want to have some kind of menu system. And we'll build that out here in a little bit. I'm not going to get too dramatic with this. Let's get back to our main program. If we just do this now, and then we call add student, and then save, we could do run, and our program continues just like it did before. Nothing changed. The idea there is we could start doing more things with this program as we wanted to. So Gina, enter, and we can get our final student list. But notice how I capitalized the A in JSON. I may want to edit that. So I may need an option to edit a student. I may need an option to insert a student, etc. So if we come back here and look at our other methods, we checked out the append. That allows us to add it. Notice that it always goes to the end of the list. It's appending it to the end of the list. So if you want to specifically put it at a given index, then you would need to use the insert function, or I'm sorry, insert method. So you would call .insert, and the .insert method requires two arguments. It requires what index you want to inject it into, and what is the value that you want to inject at that spot. So if I want, in this case, say chicken to be put in the 1 index, remember that's the second one in the list, then I would say 1 comma chicken, and it would insert it into the second spot in the list.
Can you use index as a part of that code and plus the plus equals sign and put it in a certain position?
Can you explain what you would want to try there?
Maybe I saw it somewhere to where you can use an index and use that command to put it in a certain position in a list.
Yeah, you can. It's the .index. That's exactly what I was describing here. Oh, I see what you're saying. Using the .index method inside of the .insert method.
Yes.
It wouldn't make sense because you would have to pull wherever a given value is, right? So in this case, you would have to do something. Let me pull up the prompt here just so I can show this. So you would have to do something like this. Wrong one. There we go. So say over here in the interpreter, I paste in a list and I do spam dot insert. And then in that first value, we would need to pass in the index. So I'd have to do something like spam dot index. And what you're wanting to do is something like find out where cat is. Is that right? Because you don't know what index you want to inject in. And then you want to insert there at cat, you want to put in mouse. Then what that would do, if we look at spam, is it found out with this inner function where the index of cat was. Okay, we're going to inject mouse. So that put mouse at the beginning. Is that the chain that you were asking the question about?
Yeah, it doesn't look so clean now.
It makes sense though. Let's think about it. So it's a one-liner way of doing two different functions at the same time. So it would be the equivalent of doing something like, what is my, let's just say index equals spam dot index, and we find out where cat is, because we don't know what the value of this index is in our list. Say we have, hundreds of things inside of our spam. We don't know where it's at unless we actually printed it out, found out the index, etc. So a fast way would be doing something like this. We could check index. Okay, it's in the one spot. Then what we want to do is say spam dot insert index, because that is the name of our value that we called here. And then we index whatever we want to put in. So lizard. And now if we look at spam, we have mouse, lizard, cat all the way through. What you created here was a nice little one-liner that did these two lines, and it kept you from assigning another value, etc. So not a bad way to go about it. If you want to inject something in front of somebody else, but you don't know their index. So what you're going to do is go find the index, and then you're going to insert it at that spot. Very, very valid way of doing that. Okay. So you can get an error. For example, here, if you try to insert something into a list or a value that doesn't have the ability to do that, then what you're going to see is something over here called an attribute error. And so you can use a try and except to make sure that you can append something up in there. Now notice, if you try to do this to a string, as they're doing here, you're going to get a attribute error that no string object can have the attribute append, which means you can't run that append method on a string. It's meant to be done only on a list. Same way with insert. All right, so we have the ability to append something to the list. We have the ability to insert something. We have the ability to replace something in the list, and we can delete something in the list with the del statement. So the other option is, remember the del statement, in order to use the delete statement, we have to know the index of that value. Well, we can also use one called the dot remove method, and that will allow us to remove a given item in the list if we know what the value of that item is. So dot remove, in this case, say we want to remove bat from the list, we would use dot remove. Then we could call it and we would get it through there. This differs from the delete statement because in the delete statement, scroll back up here so you can see it. The delete statement, we pass in the list and the given index. So the alternative here is we would, instead of a 2, say we wanted bat, we would have to call something like spam dot index. Inside that index, pass in bat so that we get that index value back, and then we would run that inside of a delete statement. That would also work. It's another valid way of removing something from the list, but it's not as clean because we have a built-in method called dot remove that would allow you to do the exact same thing that you just did. Then we have the ability to sort the values in a list. So remember, these are numbered, right? We have the ability to sort all the items in the list. Maybe you want it alphabetical, maybe you want it something else in between. So to do a sort, you just call dot sort on your list. Now, there's a couple caveats there. On the dot sort, it's going to do it like, say if there's all numbers in there, then it will order it from least to most. If you do it from and all have strings in there, it's going to do it alphabetically. As you can see, it's done here. So if we have ants, cats, dogs, badgers, elephants, we sort on that. Notice that we get them back in alphabetical order. If you wanted those in reverse order, then you just pass the keyword argument of reverse equals true. So we're setting the Boolean value of reverse to true, and we pass it inside sort. Notice that once you do this, that list is forever sorted. So if you don't want to sort your list or you just want to do it temporarily, we have to do some other stuff in order to do that. And we'll learn about that later. But for now, you can use this dot sort. So say we have a list like this where we have numbers and strings inside of it. If we call dot sort, it's not going to allow us to do that because we have two different data types in there. All right. One other option with the sort value is you're going to have this ability here where you have capitalize Alice and lowercase ants, capital Bob's, Carol, etc. If we do a dot sort, notice how it puts all the capital ones at the beginning, then goes back through and does the lowercase. The reason for this is sort uses ASCII-betical order, which means it's going to do capitals first, then lowercase, and then also organize them from A to Z. If you want to change how that works, then what you do is you pass in a key equals str lower. And we'll talk a little bit more about str lower in the next section where we talk about different things that we can do with strings. But for now, if you pass in str lower, it's going to do lowercase stuff first, then the capital, and move all the way through A to Z. If you just want to quickly reverse everything in the list, then you can use the reverse method, and this will quickly reverse everything in the list. So it's like sorting, just doing reverse, only you're not really sorting, you're just reversing everything in the list. Anybody have any questions about those methods that we just talked about? Okay, so one other note, I'm just going to bring back up my program here. All right, so right now we're appending everything to students. Say we had another student or another list of some sort, right? And I'm going to just make this up so that you guys can see. Now, if we do a square bracket, say we want to put in grades and we have A, B, C, D, F. Okay, so we have these all the way across here, and you can build these out however you want. But say for some reason that we had something that was significantly longer here and it was starting to run off this screen, or we have so many items that are on this screen. What you can do is if you come over here to the end of the B and hit enter, notice how idle is going to keep those nice and sorted in a row, so it's very easy to see what's going on. And so typically you hit enter like this, and this is another way to build out a list. It's extremely handy if you have a bunch of values inside of a list that's starting to run off beyond this screen. You really want to try to keep your code clipped at 80 columns going across there. So pretend like that's 80 across. Notice down here, you can get your column number at the bottom. That is going to keep you that. So it's not a requirement. The code will still execute if you run off to the right-hand side and you have to stretch this over, but really try to keep it inside 80 characters. If you use other IDEs, like we talked about, this is idle, right? If you guys use PyCharm or Xcode or some other stuff, they will typically try to keep you within the PEP 8 compliance. I don't teach PEP 8 compliance in this course just because you're getting familiar with Python and you don't necessarily have to learn the exact compliance code and everything else because it changes over time. So the idea is, if you have really long strings, like some of you guys are going to build text adventure games for your midterm. It's really popular that's what students like to do. And I'm okay with that. But you're going to have so much text that gets displayed on the screen that you may want to condense that over a little bit. And you can do that with like lists. You can do it in this fashion to try to keep everything below 80 characters. All right, let's take one last look here. You're going to have some example programs here. I do encourage you to go through and learn a little bit about these example programs because it does make sense. It will help you make sure that you understand it. Couple little things that I want to explain here before we finish up for the day. So we talked about sequence data types. This is just going to allow you to treat strings a little bit like lists, in that you can do certain things with them. So if you want to slice out a string, say I have Sophie here, I can use the 0 index, get me back the Z, or -2 gets me the I, that kind of thing. So you can treat strings a little bit like lists, and we'll talk about this more later on. We have different ways of working with those. So the terminology that we're going to use here is called mutable and immutable. What that means is a list is mutable. In other words, we can add, change, remove things inside the list. A string itself, however, is immutable, which means we cannot change the string using these type of methods. You can only reassign the entire string, but you can't manipulate the string in any way. So for example, here, if we say name of Sophie is a cat, and we want to change that 7 index, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so the A, say if we wanted to change the A to the, we cannot do that in this fashion because this string is immutable. The only way to mutate this string would be to create a new name like this, where we slice out that, we add this here, do string concatenation, then say name is Sophie is a cat, new name is Sophie the cat. So again, this is just mutable versus immutable ways of doing a list. Last but not least, I want to talk about tuple as a data type. So tuples are identical to lists, except two different things. One, tuples are done in parentheses. So notice they're just like a list, only they use parentheses here. You can still call indexes on them. You can calculate the length of them. You can do all that. But the difference with a tuple is that it's immutable. You cannot change or modify those values once they're inside there. So the reason that you would use something like a tuple is if you have set parameters inside your program that you don't plan on changing. So for example, inside our students here, we have students as a list because we want that to change. We want to be able to add things to it. We want to be able to do things to our students list. However, grades, those are pretty finite. In other words, if we're going to assign a grade to a student, we probably just want to have A through F. There's no reason for us to have, you know, Q, Z, Y, X, all those. We just want this particular set, and it's never going to change. So we would use a tuple in that regard so that it's there. Another reason that we would use a tuple in that regard is they're a little bit faster inside your code. Now, for most of you guys using coding and just getting started here, the speed does not matter whatsoever. But if you never intend for that sequence of values to change, you want to use a tuple. If you want to find out ever in a program what type that you're using, so whether it's a string or a list or a tuple, you can always use the command type. So type, and inside here you would pass that in. So if I did type students, it would return back to me that that is a list type. If I do type on grades, it would return it back as a tuple type. Same way you could pass in strings. So if you had a string that was something in there, say something like this, it would come back and say this is a string. Or if I do a type 42, it's going to say that's an integer that's in there. So type function is another handy one to use to figure out what type something is. Because you would want to do that, you may want to convert a list over to a tuple. So say you collect all this information from somebody and then it's never going to change, then you could then convert that list over to a tuple. This is something that you want to pay attention to because I will tell you now, this is on a quiz or an exam. When you work through this, in order to convert that list over to a tuple, you need to pass the list inside this tuple command. So tuple, then when you go through there, this is the tuple function, you need to pass the list on the inside. Now you can either write out the list. In your case, you probably already have something set up as a list, and therefore you would want to put brackets around that. So if I wanted to do that in my program, it would look something like tuple students would convert my students list over to a tuple. If I wanted to convert this tuple over to a list, I would use the list command. And then I can list out grades, and that would convert it over to a tuple. No, I'm sorry, a list. It would convert it over to a list. Then I could modify it and change things, and then I could change it back if I wanted to. All right. Know this, that it would go through there. Another way is if, say, you had a string like hello, you could also do that with a list. So if I do something like hello, and I convert that to a list, let's just move this over to our actual idle shell so you can see what it would look like. Notice I'm going to get each character inside of there as a list. Now I can manipulate it if I wanted to. So say I wanted to change that second index, that first L in there, to a for some reason. Then I could do something like, you know what? I'd have to set that as a value. So I could say my list equals list hello. All right, we look at my list. Now I have the hello list. So now I can change that. My list dot insert. Let's do an insert because we haven't played with that. Insert. And on that third index, we're going to put a, let's put another character in there. It doesn't matter what it is. So second index, we're going to put a Z in there and say my list. There we go. So now we have this new string with the character that we added inside of there. If I want to convert that back to a string, then what I would have to do is start with something like my string equals 2 quotes. We look at my string, notice nothing's inside of it. Then what we can do is for char in my list. So char is just standing for character is all I'm doing here. You could use whatever you want at this point, remember? So char, and then our char, then what we're going to do is say my string plus equals the char. And if we hit enter, it's going to loop through the list, add that character to the string, and we're using the that operator just exploded me there. It's like string concatenation, but you're just appending it in there. And so now if we look at my string, you'll notice that we have our string back with that letter injected inside of it. Now, this part doesn't quite make sense. You're like, why would I ever do this? Well, if you're trying to add things to a certain string or you're trying to format things later, this can be kind of handy to break out those characters. Some of you will build things like Hangman. If you do something like Hangman, then you may want to use something like a list, build out what it is, and then display it on the screen. The other way is, say you just wanted to print it, because that was the goal here, was to print my string and do that out. You could do something like in your function, you could just add this to the string and then print it out there. The other way of doing that would be like print for loop inside of there, and then you could print that inside of it and just add that to your string. All right, let me make sure there's nothing left inside of here. We do have references. So there's a couple of these I didn't get to. I didn't realize they added a lot to this last section of copy and in copy. For these last ones here of getting references in here. So reference, just real quick, this will take 2 minutes. Real quick on references, this allows you to reference over to another value. If you do that, if you change one, it's going to change the other one. And I talk a little bit about this in the video from fall of 2020. So check that out. You guys can get this last little bit here. That will show you what a reference is. ID is going to allow you to pull this back out. This is going to be just the ID of whatever we call that value inside Python. You may want to use this. We will not cover this section as we don't use it per se. We talked about passing references in. Copy. So if you want to manipulate a list, and at this point you have, if you do a reference to it and then you change that list, it's going to change that list as well. This copy method, you can do copy, so import copy, and we do copy.copy spam, and that allows us to make a copy of a list inside of there. If for some reason you have lists inside of lists, then you would need to use deep copy, and I believe we talk a little bit about that further down here. Actually, it's in another section, so we can ignore that for now. All right. If you guys want this week and you want to kind of learn how to play different things or build your little games, go ahead and do some of these practice projects. There's usually one that I assign in each one of these. Like this one has the coin flip. This one here used to be a homework assignment. See if you can figure this out this week. This actually used to be a question on a quiz, but see if you can figure this one out. You can also do something like a picture grid where you want to print something out here in ASCII. You could do this as well. All right, I won't hold anybody any longer. Let you guys get to your next class. Again, no homework this week, but I encourage you to at least try to get this comma code. See if you can make it work like it's supposed to. The idea is that you have this list and that you want it to return this value. So notice when it returns this string, you have apples, bananas, tofu, and whatever the last value is. Make sure there's no comma after the and. So how would you go about doing this and writing this little program? In this case, they want you to write a function, right? So make sure you write it as a function, not as a program itself. Remember that a function needs to be defined, similar to what we did with our students up here. So we had define, add students, etc. I'm going to save this program because we're going to build on this here in a little while to add like a menu to it, and then we can show what all these extra functions are that we learned: the remove, the insert, the delete, that kind of stuff. All right.
Would it be possible for you to upload that program to Blackboard just so we could like look at it?
The students one?
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no problem.
appreciate it.
Uh-huh. All right, I'll let everybody get out of here and we will catch you next week.